the auto industry and the politics of car culture. Where is it heading? That's our conversation today. I'm James McNabb, the General Manager of the Travel and Automotive Division of Street Content Labs at St. Joseph's Media. And today I'm here with Paul Ferris again to talk about car culture. We have a deep expertise in the automotive space, creating content around cars for quite some time.
Yes.
Today we thought instead of talking about content and what you should be doing to differentiate your brands with content, we take a little bit of a shift over and talk about cars.
Would you say we're taking a left turn into a conversation around cars?
Maybe. Paul's an accredited automotive journalist. You've been writing about cars and reviewing cars for a very long time. We have another number of other people on our staff that review cars. Car reviews are a typical part of the CA magazine, and we've also done a lot of work for Acura in the USA and Honda in general. It's a good moment to kind of take a step back and say, what's happening with car culture in the auto industry? So generally speaking, I think there's two main forces, and you may disagree with me on this, but I think there's this kind of consolidation around the generic mass market vehicles, which have become very standard set of features and almost standard set of dimensions in a lot of cases.
Right.
And then there's also what's happening in the fringes of the industry. High horsepower, electric cars, AI, automation. So, Paul, what do you think is happening with kind of the bulk of cars?
Companies like Ford, GM are scaling back on producing sedans because nobody's buying them. There are automakers are making more money by selling crossovers and small SUVs, whatever you want to call them, cute utes, SUVs, large, small. So that's why they're so popular, and people gravitate towards them, like you said, because they're hauling a lot of stuff. They like the elevated driving position. So now every other car on the road pretty much is an SUV. I think that trend is obviously going to continue because sooner or later there aren't going to be any sedans available to buy. I'd like to think that if you look over the course of several years, the cars have evolved, SUVs have evolved to become more car/sedan-like. So we'll probably evolve back into, they're not going to call them sedans, they'll call them something else, but they may get a little lower, the roofline may be a little more sleek, the car may look a little different, but we're kind of back, not quite where we started, but somewhere in between. So it's going to continue to evolve, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at one point we had kind of truckish cars coming out, and now they're turning into, is it a Bush or a Hedge? I can't tell if it's a hatchback or an SUV.
Yeah, right.
And I think that becomes an interesting question because these cars are becoming so similar, and the volume vehicles that are selling today are really, really standardized in a lot of cases. Yeah. Very close in price point, very close in efficiency, and very very basic in a lot of ways. Yeah. You can kind of buy your trim level, but that's pretty much it.
Right. I think you made a good point about the fringes. There's the cars for, this is not meant to be condescending, but cars for people who don't particularly like cars. Maybe have to buy one. They're going to keep it for 4 years, maybe lease it for a couple of years, get something else. They're not particularly concerned about the brand, the style. They just need something. So that's kind of your mass market, I think. Then there's the people on, maybe beyond that who are enthusiasts, maybe have a little more money, they're going to maybe go towards luxury car. And then there's the further out you go, there's people like who are taking cars on tracks, or people who are customizing their own cars or buying old clunkers and rebuilding them, kind of that kind of hands-on, backyard mechanic tradition that is still exists in some fashion. But I think it's an interesting point when you mentioned that when you talk about characterizing it as something that's on the fringes, it's like, that not that long ago, that stuff wasn't really on the fringes, but now it's becoming them when you're talking about things like electrification and automation, and the fact that the auto industry is changing, the way we drive is changing, the fact that the climate is in a bit of a crisis, and a lot of that goes back to emissions from vehicles, and it's like, so there's a lot going on, which is it's interesting right now from a content perspective, from a cultural perspective, take a look at what's going on with the world of cars, because it is changing. It's as an outside perspective, it's great to look at. If you're in the car business right now, it's a very tough business to be in. Trying to predict the future is always hard. I think that's where a lot of automakers are finding themselves right now.
Well, and especially with the lead time it takes to create a car, you're probably looking at a 3 to 5 year cycle to just get a car from design to market.
Speaking of the fringes, Ford is announcing a new 2020 Mustang Shelby GT500. The press release is precisely 2 sentences long, and I'll quote from this press release, James. Venomous strike. The all-new 2020 Mustang Shelby GT500 will produce 760 horsepower and 620 pounds-feet of torque, making it the most powerful street-legal Ford ever and the most power and torque-dense supercharged production V8 in the world. Enough said. And that's end quote. So they're clearly going after a high-end consumer who is interested in obviously a car, a Mustang that has the history of the Shelby, goes back to the 60s, somebody who wants that horsepower. Going forward, those are the kinds of cars that only a few people are going to buy. And that's where when you talk about, again, go back to the fringes, when you talk about that idea that car culture is shifting, I think to me, it is fragmenting a lot. There are people who are going to buy those cars, but also at the same time, they need to produce hybrids, they need to produce electric cars, they need to look into the autonomous cars that are coming that way. They really have to have both sides active right now.
It's a funny thing because I think in the mass market, people say there's almost no car culture. It just is people buying appliances and using them for mobility. And mobility kind of sucks the soul out of cars to me. It's like, it's just basically like a glorified box on wheels, and its job is to get you from A to B to the grocery store, the kids to soccer and whatever. And that's its job. And it doesn't really, nobody has feelings about it. Buying cars was a very emotional purchase. And I think more and more it's become less and less emotional. It's become very dry, and it's just, okay, what's going to check the boxes? It needs to fit baby seats. It needs to fit the dog. I've got this much luggage. I cover this many miles. I'm going to buy it or lease it, and I'm going to buy something that ticks all these boxes. And it's just, that's the job it's got to do. And 99% of the time, it's going to be a Ford Escape or a Honda CR-V or something of that character. And then meanwhile, you've got Dodge producing 700, 900 horsepower engines. You've got Ford doing this with the Mustang GT500. You've got quite a bit of variety happening. And then you look at the Teslas and you look at the electric cars, which are coming onto the market. I mean, that's crazy. And even a Model 3 is something to the equivalent of around 450 horsepower. I drove one last month, and I own a race car. This would kill it on 0 to 60 time. It's an immensely powerful vehicle with kind of wearing the eco badge while you're at it, which is kind of interesting. So I think we have a lot of interesting diversity. So we've got these two competing trends: this kind of genericism and consolidation of the mass market, and then all kinds of crazy stuff happening on the periphery. And I think those two are definitely shaping what the car industry is going to look like in the future. I think you're right; a lot of fragmentation before there's further consolidation into a platform, for example, to say, go all electric. But then we've got people like, was it Volvo, Porsche, VW are all exploring or going seriously into electric. So that's going to, I think it's Volkswagen has a relationship with Tesla, if I remember correctly. Got to fact check that. But that's going to, I think, bring a lot of the electrics into the mass market as well.
And we were talking earlier too about Rivian, the company that's based in the US that's going to produce electric SUVs and pickup trucks. And Ford has just spent a lot of money investing in. They've got someone on their board, and which in a lot of ways it's a startup similar to Tesla without kind of the hysterics of Elon Musk. But it's also a company that Ford is saying, okay, these guys probably are going to be our competitor at some point. And if we're not in that electric truck space in some fashion, they're going to eat a bit of our lunch. So it makes sense to align with them at this point. These guys at Rivian seem to be doing everything right. They bought I believe it was a Mitsubishi, a shuttered Mitsubishi plant, and reopened it and turned it into their assembly operation. So, it's interesting that you're at this point in the 21st century, we're talking about new car companies that have sprung up. There's been a lot, but for a long time,
50 years.
Exactly, for a long time, nothing happened in that space. No one was, no one said, hey, maybe I'll start a car company. And Elon Musk did, and we're at a point where we're talking about Teslas as a legitimate, vehicle for a long term. It's going to be around for a long time. How are people going to get around? That's the thing I go back to. I mean, you're right. The idea of mobility sucks the life out of enthusiasm. However, like I said, Ford and larger car companies want to play in that space because they make cars and that's what they do. So they're hoping against hope that, they're going to be able to still make cars that people are not necessarily going to use. They're going to get in and it's going to drive themselves. It's going to drive itself to take them to work wherever they need to go. I just wonder where this all goes. Where at some point, to me, there has to be some sort of breaking point where either the whole industry divides into a bunch of smaller players. We stop driving, we get too old to drive. We take the streetcar, we take the subway wherever we're going. But the younger generation doesn't follow the same path we did.
So do you think that there's going to be an ongoing proliferation of kind of enthusiast pockets? Like I see all of these niches opening up around, there was the whole eco niche around Priuses that was very relevant for a long time. There's the track day crowd. There's sports cars. There's the high horsepower guys. There's all of that sort of stuff that's out there, and that's what people seem to be passionate about.
Right.
Do you think that's going to continue, or do you think that's going to get pushed out? Do you think eventually they're going to say, I'm sorry, you're no longer allowed to drive your own cars anymore because computers can do it better and it's not safe? And that's the argument, is what's safer, a person or a computer driving the vehicle?
That's the
and
argument,
I've been in a Tesla, and it does a darn job of driving itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I was in a Ford Fusion a few years ago that they were testing an automated Ford Fusion. There were 2 engineers in the front and myself and another journalist in the back, and we drove around Dearborn. And it wasn't fully, they had the drivers there to take control if they needed to.
Yeah.
So it wasn't fully ready to go, but it did everything pretty well. You know, it stopped the right time when it was supposed to stop at a crosswalk, for example. And they had someone positioned there to push the button so the car would recognize, so they could demonstrate that. The thing it doesn't do is it doesn't, at least that one didn't, accelerate as quickly away as somebody does when they go through a crosswalk. There's that human behavior, it doesn't take over. But on the other hand, it was safer. It was probably more efficient. It was certainly a little more sane than, you know, the lizard brain of people who are in a car trying to get ahead of the next person, right?
Yeah.
So it's certainly an argument. I don't know whether that will continue. I think that I do think that the fringe stuff will continue to be fringe in a different way. I think there's a couple of things. I think there's a growing movement of people who've gone away from, or maybe moving away from, kind of the digital space and being engrossed in their phones all the time to doing something more hands-on, and cars lend themselves to that idea that you can take something and fix it and work
almost
on
like
it.
counterculture to
Counterculture,
digital
you know,
now.
the whole, there's a bit of an analog movement still underfoot, and people are much more aware of, you know, spending a lot of time in front of a screen. You should get out and do something. So I think hopefully that will take hold a little bit. Doesn't have to be with cars, but that's a perfect thing. If you have a car that needs maintenance and you want to learn how to do it yourself, then you can go and do it. So it's a hands-on thing that I think in some ways will continue. I think though that the kind of the environmental consciousness that people have now is going to continue. That's going to be a big thing, especially among younger generations. Your kids, as they grow up, are going to certainly be aware of it. You know, my daughter is, and I think everybody who has, we're all aware of it in some fashion. So we all know that, you know what, you probably feel a little guilty driving to work all the time, you know, driving a gas guzzler. And most cars now are much more efficient than they used to be, so we're in better shape. However, they're still spewing a lot of stuff out the tailpipe, you know, and it does make you think, okay, well, we got to figure this out. So if
especially when I drove the Tesla, I was in, you know, the Bay Area,
right,
and there's a supercharger station across from every Starbucks.
Yeah, and
you can go from 20% charge, 80% charge in the time it takes you to get a couple of tall pikes and get back to the car. So you're kind of like, well, I don't really have range anxiety. I just drive Starbucks to Starbucks all day long, right?
Yeah.
So
you'll be overly caffeinated, but your car will be fully charged.
So of these two trends, what do you think is going to win? The consolidation of the generic every person's automobile, or is it going to be increased fragmentation, greater catering to niche audiences, and a variety of mobility ideas?
I think it's all those things. I think it's fragmentation. And I think it's a variety of mobility ideas. I think that again, automakers are going to do what they can to stay in business. That means catering to everybody they can, from the high-end enthusiasts with cars like the Shelby and the Dodge Demon. A couple of years ago, as an aside, at the auto show here in Toronto, the CEO of Chrysler described the Demon as the payroll maker. Excuse me. He described the Demon as the payroll maker. So, obviously acknowledging these cars are crazy expensive.
Yeah.
They do stupid stuff. You know, they allow you to just spin the tires if you want to, make all kinds of noise, but they're for a certain buyer. So I think, and they know that, and they need to keep that buyer happy. They can't get out of the performance market altogether. So I think it's going to be a fragmentation. And I think, you know, only a few people are going to buy those, but a lot of people are going to buy crossovers and SUVs. Hybrids, electric cars. I think as we talked about, the electric cars get better and better, the range increases, those are only going to increase. And I think if the government decides to put more incentives back into the market.
Yeah, see, I think you're wrong completely. I think that the overriding economics are one standard platform for every manufacturer, and maybe a couple different variations of the boxes that go on that platform, but a very standard drivetrain and dimensions and system set that makes the car operate, that basically is just, they can produce en masse, it's safe, it's efficient, it's economical, and it fits 99% of people's needs most of the time.
You'll have to check back with us in 20 years to see
20
what our
years,
predictions are.
20 years, I'll put $20 on it, but everybody's driving
All right.
boring boxes and getting around town.
That's a bet.
So 20 years, we'll check back in and see where we're at.
Good.
This has been a conversation about cars this time, and we're going to be back next week with another conversation about content. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you next time.